Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all in Calligraphy and Writing Center Culture Season, which is organized to increase the cultural awareness of the community. But first of all, allow me to welcome Prof. Bernard into Political Alexandria. And I think this is first time to give lecture in our center. It is our pleasure to have you among us today, Prof. Prof. Okin has obtained PhD doctorate in 82. It's worthly mentioned that Prof. Bernard Okin has a huge contribution with their exhibition, publication, articles, a number of public lectures and conference presentations in the field of Islamic architecture. Could you allow me to translate something to Arabic? بروفيسور اوكان هو استاذ الاثار الاسلاميه بالجامعه الامريكيه. هو من اشهر اساتذه الاثار في الفن، الاثار الاسلاميه، فن والعماره. هو بقى له اكثر من 34 سنه عايش في مصر. هو واخد دكتوراه سنه 82. انتوا بشكل او باخر هتحاولوا، هو بيعرف عربي شويه. انا قلت له هل ممكن ندي المحاضره بالعربي؟ قال لي لا صعب، مع ان انا بقالي 34 سنه عايش هنا، ودي مشكله عندي انا مش عند المصريين. فبشكل او باخر انتوا تحاولوا، هو هيحاول ان يقول محاضرته بهدوء وببساطه step by step in English, because our students in our department history of faculty of arts, some of them don't understand the English. Our prof also participated and organized many exhibitions, the Islamic inscription in '99, a journey from Iran to Central Asia in 2005, and he also specializes in Persian art. And now allow Prof. Dr. Okin to give us his lecture. Please, microphone.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Saeed. Just before I begin, well, let me first of all apologize for not speaking in Arabic, but I'll try to keep it as simple as I can so that everyone can understand. Before I begin, let me just tell you a little bit about how I became to be interested and involved particularly in the inscriptions and the monuments of Cairo. In the late 1990s, I had noticed that the monuments were suffering very badly from neglect and the inscriptions were disappearing. So I was able, fortunately, with funding from the American Research Center in Egypt, to start a project to record all of the historical inscriptions and the monuments in Cairo from the 9th century, when they begin, to 1800. And we were able to record a total of about 3,250 inscriptions on just over 500 monuments. This is on a database which has English and Arabic in it, and the good news is that now we're working with Cultnat and with Dr. Nadine, who's here today with us, fortunately, and we hope to be able to produce a DVD with the database intact of this, and then perhaps later on a website where everyone will be able to access it. So, I don't know, maybe if we could just with the lights down a little bit so that we can see the image on the screen a little bit better. Thanks. So this gives you a very good example of the way in which writing on the walls in Cairo was very important. I mean, in Cairo we have thousands of inscriptions left, of course, and we can analyze them in a variety of ways, talking about their visual aesthetics, We can talk about how long or how short they were, about the sizes and the types of the scripts used, whether you can read them easily or with difficulty. You can talk about their textual content, what they actually say, and about the non-literary uses that they used. But no, if you could put it down a bit, I think I want the audience to be able to see. That's more important than me being able to read what I have in front of me, I think. So this, can you still hear me? This is an inscription that's in front of the Khanqa of Baybars al-Goshin here, dating from 1309 in Cairo. It's recording. Okay, I can use this. That's good. And you can see that there's a part that has been chiseled out. Now, Makrizi, the famous historian of Mamluk Cairo, wrote that the name of the founder, Baybars al-Goshinkir, had been removed from the facade. But in fact, if you look carefully, you can see that the name Rukn ad-Din Baybars al-Mansuri is in fact still there. So what has happened here? Well, Baybars, if you remember, was somebody who removed Nasser Muhammad from the throne. Baybars proved to be a failure as a sultan, and Nasser Muhammad came back from exile and he had Baybars executed. Now, this is a legal document. It's part really of the Waqf. It asserts the ownership of the Khanqa by Baybars. So Nasser Muhammad was unable to remove his name from it. What could he remove instead? Probably, it seems, the royal titles of Baybars, al-Malik al-Muzaffar. So this was the greatest insult that Nasser Muhammad could do instead to the legacy of Baybars, to remove these royal titles from the facade. So that shows you just how much inscriptions could matter to people who were supposed to be able to read them. Now just let me give one warning, which is that the way we see inscriptions today is not the way they looked originally. They were much easier to read originally. This is the facade of Sultan Shaban. Would this focus a little bit better, because I can see it much more clearly on my monitor here on the computer, but it looks just a little bit out of focus on the screen here. There was some restoration work done on this monument by Dina Mahom and the team working for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And it seems that many of the original inscriptions, there's one around the top of the courtyard that we'll come back to very shortly, were originally painted. And this probably applied to all of the stone, stucco, wooden inscriptions on the monuments of Cairo. So this is a little detail from the mausoleum. And when they were restoring it, they found that the background was coloured in green. The letters were originally coloured in gold, although the originals, of course, would have been much brighter than this. So the issue of the legibility is an important one. This, again, is a view of the courtyard, and that's a detail of the inscription that originally ran around the courtyard. And on this further detail, you can see some traces of this same green paint in the background, and perhaps the yellow or golden paint on the letters themselves, showing that this also originally, even on the outside of the monument, was very highly coloured and would have been much easier to read. Now, of course, because it was on the outside, the colours have faded and they weren't renewed over the centuries, but this would have made an enormous difference in the ability of us to recognize patterns. Now, this is not an inscription, but it's a good example showing you how the application of paint can make just a pattern much easier to read. So this is actually a wooden frieze from the mausoleum of Imam Shafi in Cairo, dating from 1211. That's its pre-restoration state. This is the post-restoration state. It's exactly the same frieze, the same pattern. You can make out very little without the painting, and with the different colours added, the variety of patterns becomes instantly recognizable. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the inscriptions. With the background and the letters a different colour, they originally would have been much, much easier to read. Some of the earliest surviving inscriptions that we have on the monuments of Cairo come from the Nilometer, dating from the 9th century, the period just before the Mosque of Ibn Tulun. Now, we have several historical accounts of this monument which tell us that the name of the calligrapher Ahmad al-Hasib and the caliph in whose reign it was built, the Caliph al-Mutawakkil, were originally in the original inscriptions that ran around the top of the monument. But they're not there today. So what happened? Well, in fact, this is another case of a contested inscription. Its most likely explanation is that when Ibn Tulun became the controller of Egypt after having rebelled against the Abbasids, he didn't want the Abbasid caliph's name to be visible anywhere, so he very likely removed it, and instead he simply installed Quranic inscriptions in place of where the original foundation inscription would have been. There's some other interesting information about this monument, which is that it tells us that there was a discussion amongst the leading governors of Cairo as to the content of the inscription, as to what it should have been. And in fact, there was actually a letter sent back to the caliph asking what should be in it. And it was decided that they should select appropriate Quranic verses. And also another interesting bit of information is that they specified that the background of the inscription should be painted in lapis lazuli and the letters painted in gold. So here we have a specific historical account telling us of this different use of colour to paint original stone inscriptions. The content of the Quranic inscriptions is also noteworthy because they are all about verses that speaks of the bounty of God in giving us rain, which causes crops to grow. And of course, the Nilometer measured the amount of water that was available for irrigating the crops, and so it's one of the very early examples that we have where the verses were specifically selected to match the function of the object, not something that actually was all that common later on. The Mosque of Ibn Tulun itself is also one of the best examples of an early preserved monument that we have in Cairo. Running just below the ceiling of the monument is a wooden frieze that originally was thought to have contained all of the Quran. Now, in fact, it's easy to measure the number of letters that you can get into the area that is available under the ceiling. And in fact, there was room for 1/3 of the whole Quran in it. So even so, this would have been a very impressive demonstration of the Word of God. The letters, as is typical of the style of the time, like the Nilometer examples, are still very plain. And of course, you have to imagine with the different colours, perhaps, of gold against a dark blue background, just how much more easy to read this would have been originally. This is one of some of the original foundation inscriptions, marble tablets that were recorded by the French in the Description de l'Égypte. All of those have vanished except for this panel, which is now mounted on one of the pillars near the mihrab of Ibn Tulun. The surprise is that this is relatively small, perhaps just under about 1.5 meters high. So a very different system from the later mosques where you have the foundation inscriptions in very large letters above a main gate. In this case, there are many gates into the mosque. They are all of the same size. None of them has any special decoration, so we actually don't know where this was originally designed to have been erected. The letters of that and the lilometer were completely plain. A major change in epigraphy comes in the middle of the 9th century when we start getting floral forms coming from the tops of the letters. So we have what's known as floriated kufik, and this becomes the standard form of decoration for a very long time. Following on from Ibn Tulun, I didn't give you a history lesson since I know you all know the history of Egypt and Cairo very well, so I'm not going to talk in general or in detail about the Fatimids, but we have some interesting developments under the Fatimids. They would have seen when they were in Ifriqiya perhaps this mosque, which is the Mosque Muhammad ibn Khairun in Bعنوان, dating from the middle of the 9th century. And it in fact is the very first in the Islamic world that has an inscription running on the outside of the building, something that until this period wasn't at all common. But it's something that we also find on some of the very earliest Fatimid mosques. Now their first mosque in Cairo, the Mosque of Al-Azhar, the original facade of that has not been preserved, so we don't know exactly what that looked like. But we have a lot of the original facade of this. In particular, the two minarets were highly decorated. And these are very interesting from a number of standpoints. They're different in shape. There's also more than one of them. And the only other place in the Islamic world at this time that had more than one minaret was probably at the Haramain in Mecca and Medina. And the lower part of this one is square and the upper circular. The lower part of this one is a much taller square followed by an octagon. And again, probably the only other part of the Islamic world which had minarets with tiers of different shapes at this time was at the Haramain. So there's probably an attempt to assert a visual connection with the monuments of the Haramain here. That's an important point. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But first of all, the original minarets were visible from the outside. This is a detail of the northern one. It had the foundation inscription mentioning the name of Al-Hakam. It also had some very interesting roundels that had a Quranic inscription going round in a circle. This actually was very similar also to some earlier Fatimid coins. And I'm just going to go on a little sideways excursion for a second and talk about this idea of an inscription going round in a circle. It's something that appears next in Cairene history on the facade of the Mosque of Al-Akbar. And you can see that if you start the inscription here with the Basmala, you can read it easily for the top half, but then when you get to the bottom half, it's upside down. Now, of course, if that's a Quranic inscription, it's not such a problem. You might have memorized it off by heart, but it still is a basic problem in reading. Another little wrinkle is that coming to the end, they realized they hadn't enough space for it, and so they had to cram in the last word on an upper line, which shows perhaps that they hadn't completely written it out beforehand. The next example of a circular inscription is in the mausoleum of Yahya Shabihi in Cairo. It's that little circle at the very top of the dome, and it's one which actually is almost completely illegible from the ground. I don't think since it was erected and before these photographs were taken that anybody had been able to read it. In fact, it's a foundation inscription, surprisingly, which mentions the name of the ruling caliph and the vizier As-Salat Alaya. Now, there are also a couple of roundels, for instance, on the outside of the mosque of Baybars in Cairo, Baybars al-Zahar, and these now have a different arrangement. These make it easier for the viewer to be able to read because they start going from an anti-clockwise direction and then they switch so that you can read the bottom part from the same viewpoint. So that makes it much easier, in fact, to read. They've finally got round to the idea that you have to accommodate to the needs of the viewer in this respect. So going back then to the minarets of the Mosque of Al-Hakam, I want to talk now about the large foundation inscriptions that give the name of Al-Hakam, which are present on both the northern and the southern minaret. This is the large inscription. They're extremely tall, would have been highly visible from the ground, an excellent way of proclaiming Al-Hakam's generosity in giving the community this wonderful building. But the surprising thing is that in 1010, Al-Hakam himself ordered arkan, these rukns, to be added to the minarets, which disguised the original decoration that was on them. Very strange decision, since it covers up these wonderful foundation inscriptions which mention his name and titles in great detail. So what could have caused this? Well, the only rational explanation that has been given for this is that it's related to the Haramain. I've talked about the visual similarity of these minarets to the Haramain. In 1010, there was a revolt in Palestine against Fatimid rule, which was supported by the Sharifs of Mecca, who ruled over the Haramain. And they, accordingly, at this date, they stopped sending the pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca and Medina. So all of a sudden, Al-Hakam had lost control of the Haramain. This was a very embarrassing admission of defeat for him. So the last thing he wanted was for these two visual reminders of Mecca and Medina to be left standing in Cairo. So the answer seems to be he covered them up with these square bastions so that they didn't remind anyone anymore of Mecca and Medina. A very striking proof of the importance of visual symbolism of some of the architecture in Cairo. And instead, there's just a series of Quranic inscriptions on the bands on the outside of the minarets. Now, these have been read by some later scholars, or sorry, I should say that they have been used by some later scholars as evidence to support this theory. But the funny thing is that the inscriptions that they said were there aren't in fact there. How did this happen? Well, it's because of a not unusual mistake. If you're reading an older source that mentions the numbers of the Quranic surahs and ayahs, you might find numbers that are different from those of the standard version that we use nowadays. So the numbers that were used in some of the old authorities like Van Bersham, who produced a wonderful book on all of the inscriptions and the monuments of Cairo, he used the edition of the Quran by Flugel, an old German scholar, which is the different numbering system from the modern one. So if you take the numbering system from the old one and apply it to the new one, you might end up with totally different verses. And that is what has happened in some times in Cairo. So it's just a warning for any scholar that they need to be very careful to check what the original reading of the inscription is. The gates of Cairo are more marvels of military architecture, although they do have a foundation inscription running either along them, beside them. In the case of Bab al-Futur, the foundation inscription is beside the gate. In the case of Bab al-Nasr, it's on the gate. These have some wonderful floreation, and in some cases the floreation is very carefully designed, as in this case the name of Al-Mustansir, to give emphasis to the name of the patron. So that certainly is one way of calling attention to itself. And there's another very interesting example of how you can call attention to the inscriptions of the monument in a mihrab that was added in the reign of Al-Mustansir to the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in about 1094. Now, in this case, instead of the Kufic inscriptions being floriated, the decoration is concentrated in the area behind the inscriptions. So we have a floriated scroll running behind the outer rectangular frame. In this case, or there is a geometric design behind the letters. In this case, it's only in the smaller niche that the letters themselves are floriated like the bigger ones. But the place where the eye would rest, first of all, when looking at this, would be at the top right-hand corner, perhaps. And there you'll find again the name of the patron, Almustansir. Here also, they are playing around with the previous canon of Kufic, which had the letters all along a constant baseline. But here, in fact, some of the ones are raised up a little bit, such as Abahi at the end of that line. And this is a kind of step in the direction of the use of Naskh, which will become much popular later. And we'll talk about that when we reach it in the Ayyubid period. But here is the Mosque of Al-Akmar again, dating from 1125. And this is the first example in Cairo where we have the complete facade of a monument that was used to place a foundation inscription on. So in fact, and to give it even more emphasis, the foundation inscription was repeated in this band on the top and also in the band that runs along the middle of the facade. And in fact, here again, the name of the patron, Mamun al-Batahi and the Caliph al-Amr, it's right in the middle, just above the doorway, just beside the medallion that I talked about frequently previously. The use of Naskh, the cursive inscription that replaced Kufic, in fact was thought to be an argument for placing this cenotaph, which comes from the Mosque of Sayyidina al-Hussein, to the Ayyubid period originally. But in fact, some other scholars have argued that it's much more likely that despite the presence of Naskh on this, that this was in fact erected in the Fatimid period in 1154, when the head of Hussein was reburied in the Fatimid palace, later the place that became the Mosque of Sayyidina al-Hussein. It's extremely unlikely that the Ayyubids, the Sunni Ayyubids, would have wished to commemorate a Shia saint in this matter. And so it seems that the use of cursive writing, which occurs also in some textiles in the Fatimid period, was present on monumental architecture also. Although, of course, it quickly became very popular in the Ayyubid period as well. This is the mausoleum of Imam Shafi again, dating from 1211. But in fact, the cenotaph that is over the grave of Imam Shafi was supplied earlier there by Salah ad-Din himself in 1176 as part of a madrasa that he had founded on the site. And this too is one that contains both Kufic and Naskh, quite extensive use of Naskh. And Naskh is also used for the signature of the craftsman here, Abul Ma'ali, from a family from Aleppo, who also signed some wooden works there. Signatures, in fact, are very rare in the history of Cairo architecture. This is one of the few examples that we have, and perhaps the fact that it was more common in Syria was one of the reasons why it was used in this particular example. Although there has been an argument in some scholars that there was an ideological reason for the use of cursive instead of Kufic, that cursive somehow was associated by Nur-ad-Din with the Sunni revival. But there are many other scholars who doubt this very much, and an argument against this, for instance, is a recently discovered inscription near one of the gates on the eastern wall of Cairo that's now in fact part of the Ghanailat al-Azhar, which was rebuilt by built recently by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And as you can see, this, which is a foundation inscription in the name of Salah ad-Din, is in fact still completely in Kufic. Not of the very highest standard, it's surprisingly crude in some ways. But there's a major change in the use of inscriptions as a way to advertise your generosity when we come to the Mamluk period, as you can see here from the complex of Sultan Qalawun, right in the center of the old city, comprising a madrasa, a mausoleum, there's a hospital further back, and unlike any previous facade, this one calls attention to itself not only by the new recessing of the windows, but also by this foundation inscription which runs the whole length of the facade of the building. And it gives simply the titles and name of Qalawun in great detail and in ringing praise. So let's see, so we have some wonderful phrases like let's see, Malik al-Bahrain wal-Bahrain warith al-Mulk Malik Muluk al-Arab wal-Ajam Sahab al-Qiblatayn Kharib al-Haramain al-Sharifain Qalawun al-Salihi, as well as some other nice ringing phrases. Sahab al-Diyar al-Basriya wal-Balad al-Shamiyya wal-Amal al-Faratiyya wal-Jihat al-Hegaziyya wal-Diyar al-Thalatha. So it has this wonderful variety of phrases that all call attention to the generosity, the power, the magnificence of the founder. It even has one phrase, what is it, the Kanzul Quthah wal Munqata'in, the treasury of the oppressed and the poor, which must have seemed like a bit of a joke, because in fact he press-ganged several of the passers-by. He forced them to work on his building. They had no choice about this. So, in fact, it was so bad that some of the ulama of the time said that you shouldn't pray in this building because it was erected by wrongful means. So that's just the English translation of all of that. Although there's a little bit of a miscalculation here in some way. The main entrance to the building is just here, but this inscription, which has its name, in fact, the name of Qalawun itself comes on the bay before the entrance, so it seems perhaps that they hadn't completely worked out the timing of this. There are, now, well, if I just go back to this, the actual letters that are present on the facade of Qalawun are plain. They are undecorated. Very likely, of course, they would have been painted. But we have just a few examples of inscriptions in Cairo where the letters, in fact, are very beautifully decorated. This is on the outside of the complex of Aslam Salah Dar from the middle of the 14th century. And we have these wonderful floriated scrolls running on the letters of the Kufic inscription. There are two portals in this monument, in fact. This is one of the main portals. The other one has a foundation inscription, and I'm going to show you a detail of the inscription at the bottom here. And the letters here, in fact, instead of being the usual flat examples, they're very nicely rounded, and they also have the tops of them carved with this very delicate foliate design, matching the floriated scroll that runs behind the letters. That's the exterior of the whole complex. I'll be talking about the inscription on the mausoleum in just a second, and we're going to see a detail of the main entrance here. Now, this is where I showed you the detail of the Quranic inscription, and the reason this is Quranic is because there is an upper inscription here in 3 lines, which is the foundation inscription. This is where you would normally find the foundation inscription lower down. Now, we're looking from the inside of the mausoleum here up towards the dome. And like many domes, it has two inscriptions, in fact, one on the apex of the dome, but also one at the base. But it's a very tall, narrow structure, and it's almost impossible to read from someone standing down below. The restorers, when they were working on this, recognized that this was a terrible problem, and so just to give you an idea of what it was like, they put a copy of the inscription on the drum of the dome at ground level so that you would be able to read it. But this is a problem that some scholars have wondered about. What's the point of putting an inscription on a building if no one can read it? Well, many of these are Quranic inscriptions, and it can be argued that these are a way of sanctifying a building, of making it holier through the presence of God's words on the building. And certainly that is a common practice. There's some very interesting inscriptions in the complex of Sultan Hassan, the best known monument in Cairo. And this has a particularly unusual Kufic inscription that is the main one in the large Qibla Iwan of the complex. Has some very interesting styling with 45-degree angles for many of the letters. This is a style that is called Eastern Kufic, and it's one that's found in this period mainly in manuscripts. In the main Hanafi madrasa, there is another similar inscription where the signature of the calligrapher, Katabahu, I mentioned specifically, and the Shad al-Ama'ar, the supervisor of works, is mentioned, and it's Muhammad ibn Muhsin al-Biliki, a name that is familiar to us from the historical sources. He was a member of the Awlad an-Nas, and he and his brother are both known to have penned Qurans. And so the unusual ability in calligraphy and interest that he took in it very likely explain that he in fact was the calligrapher of the main inscriptions in the complex. And in fact there are a number of details of the decoration in this building as well, such as this medallion, which are very similar to the kinds of decoration that you also find in contemporary Quranic manuscripts. Now, most Mamluk inscriptions and buildings are masterpieces of calligraphy. This is the inside of the mausoleum of the Sultan Hassan complex. And this is the unrestored part. This has been restored, so at least you can read it a little bit better. But unlike most other inscriptions, I feel that this one is very compressed. They've compressed it, they've made the letters bigger. It makes it more legible, but surprisingly, it seems to lack the elegance that is typical of almost all of the other Mamluk inscriptions that we've seen, at least. A complex that copies many of the features of that of Sultan Hassan is the complex of Sultan Barakuk, dating from the late 14th century. This was built very close to the complex of Qalaun, and he tried to rival it by having this projecting portal, a pishta, coming out from the facade, by having a taller minaret. And he also had the same idea of an inscription running the whole way along the facade with his name and titles, proclaiming his generosity. In this case, though, in fact, he, or the designer, managed the spacing of it a little bit better because, in fact, again, at the most prominent place, the top right of the portal, that's where you find the name of Barakuk. And here again, the fact that you have the foundation inscription on top means that the inscription beside the door can be of a different content. In this case, it is Quranic. And here again, like the one at Aslam Salah Dar, they've concentrated on making it as beautiful as possible. This is a very different arrangement from any other Quranic inscription in Cairo, where we have this wonderful interlacing effect that occurs in a repeated pattern above all of the letters. So this is an example where aesthetics was among the main designing feature. And there are some other examples of inscriptions which are remarkable and are worth studying simply for their aesthetic effect. An example is one in some that occurred for the first time towards the end of the 15th and early 16th century. This is the interior of the madrasa of the Sultan al-Hori, and I'm going to show you a detail of the inscription that is on the dado that runs around the courtyard. Where we have a style of Kufic, there is a constant baseline here, but again it's a very decorative one. It's inlaid in marble and coloured with bitumen, with tar in black against the background. And so the letters have these exaggerated loops above and below the constant horizontal baseline. And this was a style that even stayed popular into the early Ottoman period. This is the Mosque of Suleiman Pasha on the Citadel in Cairo, dating from 1529. It has some typical Ottoman features, such as the painting that you have on the domes, but the dado and the mihrab, including this same kind of very decorative Kufic inscription that's copied from the earlier Mamluk examples. Another type of inscription that is very much decorative is square Kufic, where you have all of the letters at in a square or rectangular form at right angles to one another. Because of this, it's very easy to confuse one letter with another, and it's very hard to read. So they usually kept it to very simple phrases, like the word Muhammad, repeated 4 times in each of these, and in each of these are from the complex of Qalawun, from his mausoleum, dating from 1284. A slightly more unusual example is these hexagonal panels. These are from the shrine of Sheikh Zainuddin Yusuf, early 14th century. And these have the name of Ali written 3 times. In fact, that was a place where the Adawiya Tariqa of the Sufis, who were probably Shia, lived. And this is a detail of the interior of the Mosque of Amir Hussein in Cairo. And here again, in this detail, we have exactly this same design of the 3 Ali design in stucco, very unusual one for Cairo. But it's actually one that's very common in Iran, where you find it in a lot of tile work. And this, in fact, is a drawing from a manuscript known as the Topkapi Scroll, which is a series of drawings that were used for tilework designers. This one probably dates from the Timurid or Turkmen period from the 15th century. And you have exactly the same design in the center of this hexagonal piece. So as I said, it's normally in fact used simply for phrases that are very easy to read, but there's a panel at the base of this minaret of the Abu al-Ela Mosque in near Bolak in Cairo, which gives in fact the name of the founder of the title. So it's a bit like a foundation inscription rather than the usual one simply of Quranic or pious names and phrases. But there's also a very spectacular Ottoman example that is found in the Mosque of Al-Azhar, dating from the 18th century, which gives the names of Muhammad the Prophet and the 10 companions who were promised paradise as well, in a very interesting variation on this type of script. The content of some of the inscriptions is also very interesting. Now, we looked at this before when we were talking about the dado, but I'm going to show you a detail of one of the inscriptions over the doors, and it contains an extract from the Burda of al-Busiri, the famous poem in praise of the Prophet that became very popular after it was written in the Mamluk period in the 14th century. And in fact, it's also found not just in mosques in Cairo, but very frequently in houses as well. And we know of some occasions when recitations of the poem took place within houses. so that would explain why it was so popular there. A rather rarer type of inscription that is found occasionally are waqfs, the endowments that specify the revenue from which the upkeep of the foundations were able to come from. And this is the complex of Al-Ashraf Barsbeh in central Cairo, dating from the early 15th century. And the main inscription here that runs all around the courtyard and in the Qibla Yuan describes in great detail all of the foundations that were attached to the waqf of the complex. Another unique case is the mausoleum of Hassan Sarqa, dating from the early 14th century, the Mamluk period, which in the stucco inscription in the mausoleum contains extracts from the Maqamat of al-Hariri, famous of course for its very fancy, very flowery language, but which also contains some very eloquent passages in praise of God, which are reproduced in this particular example. Another unique example for Cairo is, it's very hard to read, I know, is a hilya, which is a description of the physical properties of the Prophet. Now, the earliest example I know of this is actually from a 13th century source in India, the earliest example, at least on a monument. The most common examples of it that are found are in paper from the Ottoman period. This particular one is from the mausoleum of Abdurrahman Khat Khuda, which is attached to the Mosque of Al-Azhar. So it dates from the 18th century. But as I say, there are many, many more examples of this found on paper from the Ottoman period when it became very popular. So let me just summarize by saying, I hope it's clear from what we've been talking about today just how important epigraphy and calligraphy was to people in the monuments of Cairo. It was a way for the benefactor, the patron, to proclaim his might to the people passing by on the walls. It was a way to provide holiness for the building by adding the word of God to it from the Quran. It was a way to add aesthetic beauty to the building by having these colourful inscriptions in a variety of beautiful scripts added to it. And so it held many meanings, and we can be sure that even now they're impressive to us. When they were in their original condition, in the beautiful colours that they had originally, they must have been even more magnificent to passers-by. Thank you.